The mineralocorticoids, again, were the outer layer of the cortex. Let's start to take a look at the middle layer, the glucocorticoids. And the big glucocorticoid, that's the example here, is cortisol. It's a big stress hormone that's all related to being able to raise the amount of glucose. Now, when we looked at human growth hormone, we looked at T3 and T4. They all worked at being able to raise glucose levels or utilize glucose as a metabolic substrate and also utilize fats. Both of them have been protein sparing because, like I said, protein will be used to build molecules from. Now, cortisol is going to promote the breakdown of proteins and fats to form glucose. So the term for this of forming glucose from proteins and fats is another form of gluconeogenesis. The other way we saw that was the conversion of lactate into glucose. This is another form of being able to form glucose. Because as you know, glucose is our metabolic substrate for going into glycolysis and producing ATP through the through the Krebs cycle and electron transport chain. So raising sugar levels is extremely important in this cortisol hormone. You'll also see that cortisol also actually has other profound effects. It is also anti-inflammatory, which is also another stress response. So inflammation is a stressful response, and that cortisol comes in to act as an anti-inflammatory. And what that does is it limits the effect of white blood cells. The other thing about cortisol, though, looking at cortisol, is it also affects the rate at which, even though it reduces the inflammation through our prostaglandins and leukotrienes, it also slows down the rate at which we can heal from wounds. So tissue repair.
On the slide, it says they're inflammatory. It's missing the anti.
It's missing the anti? I think I wrote back in. Yeah, so right anti-inflammatory effects. I won't put it on the test then. So with that, and I did upload the current copies onto Dropbox. A lot more phones appearing. I remember started off like the semester with one little recorder appearing. Now there's just more and more phones. So looking at the effects of cortisol, if you were to think of certain drugs that have cortisol in them, hydrocortisone, especially knowing that we kind of had a humid summer. I know there's more mosquitoes around. Hydrocortisone is an anti-inflammatory that can be placed in that area. You have other corticosteroids. You have triamcinolone. Triamcinolone works really well as an anti-inflammatory. However, they do tell you don't use too much of it because it will slow down wound healing. So typically not something you want to add to wounds because it will retard its growth. The other things that are also used are, so if you have hydrocortisone, I mentioned also triamcinolone. We also have prednisone. Prednisone is another big one. That's a very strong corticosteroid. And those work on the inflammatory pathways that are more systemic. Has anybody ever used prednisone before? Yeah, very strong drug. What you'll notice about prednisone, very effective. But just because it works higher up on that level, but not really meant for chronic use. Typically, if you have, I've had prednisone when I had a really bad case of hives after being exposed to some kind of pollen. I have no idea where, but actually I do know where. It was the Huntington Gardens. I remember walking through, and all of a sudden I got this nasty reaction that had me in a bout of hives that lasted 2 weeks, and I couldn't sleep, and I just welted up everywhere. And eventually I went to the hospital, and I remember them giving me prednisone and giving me cortisol shots. Cortisol injections, if you ever get them injected into your joints, work to reduce the inflammation in that area. So they gave me a shot of cortisol, and it worked, and it worked within minutes, and I remember being able to fall asleep, and I slept for 24 hours. But nonetheless, they're very powerful drugs. But some of the side effects with chronic use of corticosteroids are the presence of pressure sores, bed sores, especially people that are on long-term prednisone. You'll see that they're prone to building up ulcers. Water retention is also a big issue. Let's see what long-term use does on the next slide over. Corticosteroids have cortisol in them, and it's basically the same structure, corticosteroid, that you see with long-term prednisone use. Long-term usage of cortisol results in something called Cushing syndrome, and something that you see with long-term prednisone use is increased fat deposition. So what you would see is typically what we call moon face. It's the ballooning of the face combined with fat deposition, also water retention. You also see the what we call truncal obesity, where they develop a lot of fat deposition on the trunk. You'll see typically like skinnier legs, skinnier arms. You do get the flushing that takes place on the face. That's very prominent. Hyperglycemia, so pretty much what you'll start to see is symptoms of diabetes, high blood sugar. You see diabetic ulcers that start to appear. And osteoporosis is another mechanism in place that's affected. So these things are very strong considerations for putting somebody on a long-term anti-inflammatory such as prednisone. The last of these is to take a look, well, actually we don't talk about the weak androgens. Let's go back directly into the inner layer, the small 10 to 15% remaining of the adrenals called the adrenal medulla. And again, this is the modified sympathetic ganglion that we are supposed to see emerge with our postganglion cells. So this sympathetic ganglion that's turned into endocrine tissue is going to produce our catecholamines. Here we see our epinephrine and norepinephrine. In other words, adrenaline and noradrenaline, where epinephrine is the biggest of them all. Not biggest, but the majority of what we produce is epinephrine. Epinephrine and norepinephrine have a synergistic relationship together. So if we have both of these working together, we'll really promote the sympathetic response. The pancreas, let me take a step back. Epinephrine and norepinephrine, these are things that are going to, like I said, to promote the sympathetic response. So increased heart rate, increased respiratory rate. We're going to see increased, again from our quiz, would be glycogenolysis. What else is there? We'll see decreased digestion. Anything that's the opposite of our parasympathetic responses, so no salivation, lacrimation, urination, defecation, digestion. All of those are going to be stunted. All in all, to allocate more of our blood to the more critical organs. So things like the brain, the lungs, the heart, and the muscles as well. Pancreas. Pancreas we'll learn in our digestive lecture, but the endocrine functions are going to be seen specifically for the production of insulin and glucagon. So we're going to go in and take a look at the structure of the pancreas. Let's zoom in specifically on the functional units. So the endocrine functions, again, here you see that it's going to be involved in digestion. We don't really want to talk about the exocrine cells. We're going to focus in on the acinis, which are basically like these little clusters of grapes that are put together. When we zoom in on the acini, we're going to take a look at our cuboidal cells, which are involved in the exocrine functions for the production of our digestive enzymes. What we want to focus on are the endocrine cells right in the middle. See, here you can see our lavender and our purple, as well as our green cells, which are known as alpha, beta, delta, and then what we call PP cells. And I'll show you that in just a little bit. The Within the cluster in the middle are going to be our endocrine tissue. When we take a look at that pancreatic islet, the area that we're really focusing on is called the islet of Langerhans. This is the endocrine tissue that we're looking for. So these 4 cells that we see, alpha, beta, delta, and F cells, are the ones that are going to be secreting hormones. And each of these cells within that islet of Langerhans are going to produce specific type of hormone. Alpha cells are going to produce glucagon. So glucagon will raise blood sugar. And the way glucagon works, where it targets specifically liver cells to undergo glycogenolysis. The liver cells, yes, hepatocytes. So cells in the liver to undergo glycogenolysis. So lyse your glycogen, and that starts raising glucose levels, which glucagon does. Beta cells, on the other hand, are going to produce insulin. And what insulin is going to do? It is going to decrease blood sugar. So it's considered an anabolic hormone because it's turning glucose into glycogen. It's polymerized form of glucose. So what that's going to do, well, this is going to be called glycogenesis. Glycogenesis. And you can see that the two work hand in hand. Both glucagon and insulin work together to regulate blood sugar, again, between our set point of 700 to about 120 milligrams per deciliter. We don't want too much of it. We don't want too little of it. Excess glucose in the blood, or high blood sugar, starts to then affect the tonicity of our blood. So typically what would happen is if we have the inability to clear blood glucose, that excess glucose is going to make our blood more hypertonic, more solutes in the blood. If there's more solutes in the blood, what that's going to do, it's going to cause water, the direction of osmosis, to leave the cell to enter or exit into the extracellular fluid. What that could also potentially do is it also down, especially in the lower extremities, can cause water retention. So people that have hypertonic blood, meaning, I know I'm kind of deviating a little bit. If we were to take a look at the tonicity, it's solute over water. Now, if you want to maintain proper tonicity, and now we start to increase the amount of solute by glucose retention, storing excess glucose, that's going to want to drive, in order to maintain tonicity, they want to also increase the amount of water, right? So excess solute, we don't want that. We want to, in order to balance it, we can either get rid of solutes, which is not something that diabetics are great at doing because they've got all this glucose in there. But the other thing is going to be water retention. So something that people that diabetics especially complain about well, not complain about, a symptom that they present with in a clinic is not only would they see clinically, they would see high glucose, but they're always constantly thirsty. And that thirst is due to that drive for water. So naturally what you would see is that they have high antidiuretic hormone, right? Antidiuretic hormone that's trying to retain water. And so you get typical symptoms of bloating, you get edema, you get the storage of water.
Is that why like the kidneys stop working at some point?
Well, what's happening with that excess glucose is that their body has to get rid of it. And so kidneys are going to be doing exactly that. They're constantly filtering to get rid of that glucose. And if your kidneys are constantly working, over time they're going to start decreasing in function because they're constantly churning out glucose. And eventually what happens with people with diabetes is that with the dysfunction of the kidney, you're going to see an increased response and more glucose building up. And then eventually, that's, I think the question came up earlier, where when dialysis comes into place, that's where you're going to have to rely on external machines to be able to filter and remove the excess of blood. Because not only are you going to now lose the inability to remove glucose, you have the buildup of other byproducts like urea, and you've got ammonia being stored. You've got stuff that, that you're supposed to be getting rid of, but you can't. So that is, back to what I was saying, is insulin and glucagon. Let me erase this so you guys at least understand the mechanisms of it, of how they're supposed to work hand in hand. The other hormone that's also produced is somatostatin. And somatostatin is, again, one of the cells that, one of the hormones that are produced by our delta cells. Somatostatin was our growth hormone inhibiting hormone that comes back in and limits the production of human growth hormone by the anterior pituitary. So if you're wondering what that growth hormone inhibiting hormone is, that's where we learn the pancreas is involved. Since the pancreas is also involved in the production of digestive enzymes, somatostatin comes in and limits it. Okay. What somatostatin also does is it also inhibits insulin and glucagon release, so therefore limiting insulin. If we've got enough blood sugar as is, let's limit it from releasing insulin into our circulatory system. This whole slide right here basically takes us through the same pathways. What we saw earlier for calcium regulation, you see the same thing for glucose and insulin regulation, where we get glucagon being produced in response to hypoglycemia, low blood sugar. Low blood sugar would result in glucagon being released. Glucagon then acts on the liver cells to undergo glycogenolysis. But also at the same time, gluconeogenesis, to convert certain amino acids into lactic acid. So all in all, we're trying to raise blood sugar. So now that we've got the release of sugar, if glucose starts to rise above that set point of 70 to 120 milligrams per deciliter, that sugar will come back in and inhibit the production of glucagon. At the same time, inhibition of glucagon will take place, and insulin will come into place to reduce blood sugar. So hyperglycemia will stimulate the beta cells to secrete insulin, and insulin works to undergo glycogenesis. So glycogenesis here, we see not only is insulin involved in the storage of glycogen, it's also an anabolic hormone. So we also increase protein synthesis, the uptake of amino acids for the purposes of producing proteins. We also see production of fat. So excess energy storage is lipogenesis. At the same time, we also want to limit the glycogenolysis. So this insulin is going to come in and block glycogenolysis and block gluconeogenesis. Again, these two things are contradictory, so we want to make sure that when insulin comes in, any of those receptors that come in will end up inhibiting these functions while promoting these. So therefore, maintaining all of this to maintain us at that particular set point. So with these, when we look at where glycogen is stored, most of the glycogen is stored in the muscles itself. About 75% when you look at glycogen, 75% in the muscle, and then about 25% stored in the liver. We can store maybe about, I think it's about 500 grams. Again, you don't really need to know this, but just for your own curiosity, we have 500 grams of glycogen. So we've got plenty of glucose storage. Anterior pituitary hormones. I'm going to kind of start to move through these. I'm going to not spend too much time on our reproductive hormones, simply because it's all listed out here. FSH and LH are going to be our gonadotropes. The gonadotropes in the anterior pituitary are producing these hormones. FSH for follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. These are the two sex hormones that are produced that will affect both males and females. I know you'll see the term follicle stimulating hormone. I know men don't have follicles, but they are involved in the production of sperm in men. The other thing about luteinizing hormone in women is going to be involved in ovulation. So when we look at the menstruation, the process of menstruation, ovulation is going to play a major role in the formation of the corpus luteum. I don't spend too much time on this. I know Dr. Finks loves to spend time on this because this is his forte, things that he loves to ask on, and I really don't spend that much time on it. I know he's got like a whole lecture on it because he loves this stuff. Testosterone production, luteinizing hormone, again produced by the gonadotropes, is the testosterone production. The thing of remembering the difference between which is which. Follicle stimulating hormone, FSH, if I can write it right, FSH. A way I remembered follicle stimulating hormone responsible for sperm production in males is FSH kind of looks like fish, and sperm kind of swim like fish. So that's the way I remember it. The other one for luteinizing hormone is the production of testosterone in men. So LH, and then thinking of LHA, like hairy apes. And these are the secondary sex characteristics for men. So things from medical school that, again, mnemonics that they have you guys remember so that you can remember the difference between the two. I don't have one for females, so I apologize for that. So, and looking at, and you should be able to see if you see follicle stimulating hormone, formation of follicles in the ovary, and then luteinizing hormone is the other one. It's the production of estrogen and progesterone. Looking at the gonadal hormones, again, you can kind of see where these are involved. The estrogens and progesterone are heavily involved in the formation of, you'll see on the next slide over, the process of secondary sex characteristics for women. You'll see the rising levels of estrogen and progesterone. Again, also involved in the monthly cycle. You're going to see the changes in the hormones. A lot of people like to emphasize on these levels, especially in women, because you can see the circulating levels, the development of the corpus luteum, and so forth. I really don't spend that much time on it, because I know we've talked about all the other hormones involved in place. The other thing I want to talk about is, the testes, again, production of testosterone, which we know is the major androgen. Women don't produce testosterone, they do produce androgens from the adrenal cortex. Right. The pineal gland is the last of the glands that we'll talk about. Pineal gland is all for the production of melatonin. Not melanin. Melanin is for our melanocytes, for pigmentation. Melatonin is all involved in our circadian rhythm. It's our internal clock that we can maintain. The pineal gland is right attached. If you look right by the third ventricle, you can't really see it in this slide, but there it is right above the third ventricle, right near the brainstem. And all that is involved is the production of melatonin, which is actually all related, in their secretion of melatonin, is all related to light levels. So melatonin, we start to secrete more in darkness. Once exposed to light, we'll start to inhibit melatonin. So for those of you that are going to bed at night and you've got the phone right in your face, you've got all this light blaring in, melatonin is not rising and makes it difficult for you to sleep. Melatonin, if you were to lay in darkness, over time, melatonin levels start to rise and will start to create that feeling of sleepiness. So melatonin on a nightly basis, you can see how it works on a daily basis. For seasonal, for especially in other organisms, we'll start to see different levels of melatonin, especially for animals that do hibernate. So all of this is related specifically to the wake cycle, sleeping and waking cycle for humans, and more so for hibernation for other species as well. All right, with that being said, Now we're going to start to take a look at the last thing that we want to talk about. The next slides over is to talk about general adaptation syndrome. I can describe this very quickly. It's how we respond to long-term stress. What is the response to stress? The first thing we need to start off is, why is stress so important? Why do we need it? Well, stress, from a psychological perspective, is important because it's something that drives us. It's something that that promotes the sympathetic response. It is a potent motivator, and when you think about what happens in terms of rising stress levels, it's our ability to be able to tap into our fat resources and protein if we absolutely need to. So you can see stress as a form of things that take place during, let's say, not only do we see this with rising cortisol levels, but also starvation. How do we tap into our own body to be able to provide enough energy for us to continue doing what we're trying to do? So this is naturally the stress response that's measured, bless you.
Thank you.
And that stress response is our way for our body to respond to stress. And so what we want to typically do in order to maintain homeostasis is to limit the amount of stress that's taking place. But we want to see what's happening on a long-term level when we're constantly stressed out. So this is the different stages. We're going to take a look at the 3 different stages that take place with a stressful response. And again, lending itself to a long-term response. The first response that we would see is the alarm stage. And this is the fight or flight syndrome. And naturally what you would see is a very pronounced sympathetic response. Elevated heart rate, elevated respiratory rate. What you're doing is allocating your nutrients, your glucose and oxygen, to your critical organs, your brain, lungs, and skeletal muscles. You also start to see the other systems come into play to make sure that we can increase blood volume and blood pressure. Okay, so we want, because we've got increased heart rate, you'll see blood volume, blood pressure. Your kidneys are also working to keep it ramped up. The next stage with continued prolonged stress response is the resistance reaction. And what takes place here are the hypothalamic releasing hormones. So we have the release of cortisol. So we have ACTH. We have thyroid hormones T3 and T4. And those are going to specifically work in order to be able to supply energy from fats and carbohydrates. Now, levels of cortisol will also utilize, not only with T3 and T4, but you'll also see protein. So again, like you saw earlier with prolonged use of prednisone, you saw muscle wasting that comes with it too. So this is, cortisol is a catabolic hormone in terms of being able to break apart these macronutrients to provide for it. So here you see the general adaptation syndrome. You see the hypothalamus come into play. You see ACTH from the anterior pituitary. You see activation of the adrenal medulla to start increasing the level of catecholamines. You see increasing levels of ACTH will result in glucocorticoids. So we have, not only do we see our epinephrine and norepinephrine, we also see cortisol levels. And all of this is tied into gluconeogenesis, glycogenolysis, and inactivation of glycogenesis. This is all to promote increased sugar response, to be able to readily provide nutrients for those critical organs. The last stage is when you've exhausted yourself. You've run out of glucose. You are running low on nutrients. This is prolonged exhaustion. Typically what happens in these cases is even higher levels of cortisol. If you're running low on glucose, what's going to happen is cortisol levels will even rise even more. You're going to get even more epinephrine. So think about something burning out. That's exactly what's happening with exhaustion. And long.
Is this why people stress eat?
That's short-term stress. This is like long-term stress. Very long-term stress. And up to the point that it starts to affect your hormone levels. You get to the point of muscle wasting. You start to see that. Compromised immune system. Think of really long-term prednisone use. You basically see the same things taking place. Ulceration of the GI tract, all the things that are working to maintain calcium levels. And then failure of the pancreatic beta cells. These are involved in insulin. Due to that excess glucose that you experienced earlier, excess glucose through cortisol, we had epinephrine also working. We had glucagon working to raise glucose levels. That elevated glucose results in insulin being secreted. Remember, over time with high glucose, insulin is going to be continually being secreted to bring it back down. So then your beta cells in your pancreas start to fail, and typically you'll have diseases take place from that point on. So this is the last case scenario of prolonged stress response. Last thing on here is to just summarize everything that we've looked at. Everything in our in this lecture, we looked at the two big things: blood glucose regulation and calcium regulation. So these from here, make sure that you touch on looking at which ones are going to be antagonistic hormones. We mentioned insulin versus glucagon, parathyroid hormone versus calcitonin. Reduce calcium, raise calcium. Reduce blood sugar, raise blood sugar. Understand the other mechanisms in place for blood sugar regulation, which is going to involve our growth hormone release, as well as our cortisols. So with that, all that tied into metabolism, when you do your studying, kind of put it together, look at the big picture, and then hone in on each of the different hormones. It's not enough to just go in and just memorize. With memorization, you don't really just understand. If you get the big picture first and zoom in and understand that, well, all we're trying to do is maintain normal levels of calcium and blood glucose, that's a good starting point. So with that, good luck studying. I will get I'm actually going to stay up tonight again like I did last night to do some more editing, and I will get that sensory lecture out to you guys. Right now, if you want to get a head start, feel free to start looking at the slides. There's some sensory lecture happens to actually be one of my favorite ones just because there's some fun things on there, but you'll be able to see it on that video. And I'll post it up on YouTube, send out the links to you guys. Good luck. If you guys have any questions on anything, feel free to hit me out.
Quizzes?
Oh, quizzes, yes. I'll get them out. Yes, thank you for reminding me.